Right before the final presentation of a $150 million deal, the boardroom of Thornwell Solutions is tense. Investors are dialed in, the countdown has begun, and executives are finalizing every detail of the pitch. The stakes couldn't be higher, and everyone knows that this moment could define the company's future. But then, as the door creaks open and an old janitor shuffles in, carrying a mop and bucket, he whispers, "That's the wrong formula." The room freezes. A room full of well-paid executives, analysts, and leaders suddenly finds themselves questioning everything, and no one knows that the janitor standing in the doorway holds the key to saving it all. It was 11:48 a.m., and the boardroom on the 20th floor of Thornwell Solutions headquarters in the Glasswell Convention Center was buzzing with anticipation. The executives were sitting on the edge of their seats, their eyes glued to the screen that displayed the company's latest pitch, a $150 million merger that would decide the future of Thornwell Solutions. Blake Thornwell, the CEO, stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back, looking every bit the part of a leader with his tailored navy suit and calm demeanor. His sharp eyes scanned the room, ensuring everything was in place. The projectors flickered as the final slides loaded, showcasing projections, growth forecasts, and models that had been painstakingly reviewed by the company's brightest minds. Behind the scenes, the tech team worked feverishly, double-checking the live stream connection, while the CFO and head of strategy reviewed the numbers one last time. Every eye in the room was locked on the screen, but Blake's gaze occasionally flickered to the door. A half-smile played at his lips, a sign that he was confident this was going to be his company's crowning achievement. "Ready for the pitch, Blake?" A voice from the back asked. It was Howard Denton, the CFO, looking through the final projections. "Ready," Blake replied, straightening his tie. Outside the room, Jade Ellison, a middle-aged black woman, moved through the hallways with purpose. Dressed in her crisp black shirt and white apron, she balanced a tray of cappuccinos and water glasses, her steps light but deliberate. As the janitor at the convention center, she was used to being invisible, her work always behind the scenes. Yet as she walked past the open door of the boardroom, something unusual caught her eye. The large projection screen displayed a formula that was supposed to guide the company's growth for the next 5 years. Her eyes narrowed. There was something wrong. She couldn't explain it, but she knew instantly. Her mind, trained in the patterns of numbers and equations, saw it in an instant. The formula was off. Jade had been working at the convention center for nearly 10 years, cleaning floors, setting up events, and sometimes serving guests at high-profile meetings like the one taking place in the boardroom. Her work was a constant cycle of hard labor and quiet observation. She noticed things that others didn't, not just the dust collecting in corners, but the subtle details that made the difference between success and failure. Her mind, sharp and analytical, had once belonged to a different world. She had been a top student, excelling in math and science, her mind an intricate web of equations and logic. At 19, she was the star of her university's data science program, winning national awards for her ability to predict complex systems. But that was before life took a turn. Her mother's unexpected stroke, combined with the rising bills and a younger brother who needed constant care, meant that Jade had to abandon her academic dreams. She withdrew from school and, without hesitation, took the first job that would help her support her family, a janitorial position at the convention center. The degree she never finished, the equations she had mastered, the research she had started, they all faded into the background of her life. Every day she hid her brilliance behind a broom, a mop, and a tray of coffee. But it was still there, lurking in the back of her mind, a quiet storm of knowledge she kept to herself. Jade had noticed something strange earlier in the day while she was setting up the catering trays for the event. The executives, the ones running the numbers for the pitch, were using outdated data. She had overheard phrases like quarterly volatility models and 97.8% confidence interval, all numbers that, as far as she could tell, were based on flawed assumptions. But Jade wasn't about to speak up then. She had no business correcting multi-million-dollar formulas while holding a coffee tray. But this time, when she saw the formula displayed on the screen, the same one they were about to pitch to investors, she couldn't ignore it. She stopped in her tracks, her heart racing. The formula was wrong. It wasn't a minor error. It was a fundamental flaw that could lead to false projections, overvaluation, and disaster. Jade glanced around the hallway. The room was filled with influential figures, the future of Thornwell Solutions hanging in the balance. No one had noticed her yet, but this was her moment. The world didn't know it, but this janitor had the knowledge to change everything. She hesitated. A part of her wanted to walk away, to pretend she hadn't seen the mistake and continue with her work. It would be easier, safer. But then she remembered what it felt like to be invisible, to have your genius overlooked. Her hand tightened around the tray, and she took one more step toward the door. Then, with a calmness that surprised even herself, she leaned through the doorway, her voice low but clear. "That's the wrong formula." The room froze. Executives turned in their seats, eyes wide with confusion. Blake Thornwell, standing at the head of the table, turned slowly, his sharp gaze meeting hers. The irritation was immediate. "Excuse me?" Blake's voice was sharp, his tone dismissive. "Who are you?" Jade stood tall, her posture unchanged, holding the tray steady in her hands. She hadn't been invited to the meeting, hadn't been asked to contribute, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. "Your growth coefficient is off by 0.06, she said, her voice calm. "If you use that formula, your 3-year forecast will show false acceleration." The room was dead silent. Blake blinked, visibly frustrated. "You're a janitor," he snapped. "What do you know about our forecast model?" Jade didn't flinch. "I read it as I passed by," she replied simply, her eyes unwavering. "It was right there." Someone in the back of the room snorted, while another muttered, "Who does she think she is?" But Jade, unbothered, nodded respectfully, her calm demeanor cutting through the rising tension. "I just wanted to make sure you know," she said. "That formula will fail under scrutiny." With that, she turned, her footsteps steady as she walked away. The room remained frozen, and for a brief moment no one knew what to do. The hum of the boardroom was thick with tension. Blake Thornwell, the CEO, adjusted his cufflinks nervously, then straightened his posture, trying to regain control. The pitch was seconds away from going live. But the voice that had just spoken, low, calm, almost a whisper, still lingered in the air. "Is the wrong formula?" The janitor's words echoed in his head. Blake tried to shake them off, but the confidence in her voice made him uneasy. Who was she? And how did she know the formula so well? The room had fallen silent after Jade's remark. Executives exchanged confused glances, unsure whether to laugh or react. Blake swallowed his growing frustration and turned toward the screen. Rereading the projection graph, his mind clicked into overdrive. The numbers on the screen were supposed to represent a growth forecast, growth that would make or break the $150 million deal they were about to pitch to the investors. He squinted at the formula, scanning for an error, but everything appeared to be in order. "Is this some kind of joke?" he asked aloud, breaking the silence. The CFO, Howard Denton, remained silent, his gaze flickering nervously between Blake and the door. Blake tried to brush it off with a tight smile, but Jade's calm certainty gnawed at him. Blake needed to focus. The countdown to the live stream continued ticking down, seconds disappearing like grains of sand in an hourglass. The investors would be watching any moment now. "I'm not taking any chances," Blake said firmly, attempting to regain authority. "We're ready. Let's go live. They won't question the numbers. We've double-checked everything." But in the back of his mind, a whisper of doubt lingered. What if the janitor was right? What if there was a flaw that no one had noticed? As the executives huddled around the screen, still unsure whether they should listen to the janitor or dismiss her as an insignificant figure, Thomas Hill stood outside the boardroom, his old tired hands gripping a mop handle. Thomas had worked as a janitor at Glasswell Convention Center for over a decade. He knew every corner of the building, every room's layout, every creak of the old wood floors. But more than that, Thomas had always been sharp. He wasn't just cleaning floors or wiping down windows. He was quietly observing. Over the years, he'd learned more about the business world than most people ever would. He'd overheard more financial discussions, seen more complicated projections, and watched executives stress over numbers than any outsider would expect. What the room didn't know was that Thomas had once been one of those people. Before life took him down a different path, he had been a prodigy in engineering and mathematics, a gifted student with a mind that could pick apart the most complex formulas. At 19, he had been a rising star in his field, winning awards for his ability to predict outcomes with precision. He'd been accepted into a prestigious university with a full scholarship to study data science, until everything changed in a single moment. The sudden loss of his mother to a stroke, coupled with the pressure of supporting his younger siblings, forced Thomas to abandon his dreams. He left the university, dropped his studies, and took on any job he could find. The janitor's uniform was a far cry from the crisp shirt and tie he used to wear in the lecture halls, but his mind had never stopped calculating. It had only become sharper with age. Now, as the janitor in a building filled with business leaders and executives, he moved unnoticed, listening, watching, and occasionally spotting flaws, like the one that had just been pointed out in the boardroom. The formula was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, just as he could sense the air shift as the clock ticked closer to 11:50. Inside the boardroom, Blake felt the first pangs of doubt creep in as the room buzzed with uncertainty. No one had listened to the janitor, but now a seed of doubt had been planted. Howard Denton, the CFO, leaned in closer to the screen, scrutinizing the numbers. The voice of one of the analysts, Mira, broke through the murmur. "Blake, I think she might be right," Mira said, her voice filled with reluctance. "The multiplier, it's off." "What?" Blake snapped, turning toward her. He had no time for this. The investors were almost waiting to connect. "We've vetted this model 5 times, Blake muttered, running his hand through his hair. "It's fine. It has to be fine," Mira continued, her voice shaky but insistent. "The base formula assumes a fixed churn rate, but it's dynamic. If you don't adjust that—" "We don't have time for this," Blake interjected, but his voice lacked the usual firmness. There was something unsettling about the situation. He could feel the weight of the live pitch bearing down on him. The tech team members started to exchange worried glances. One of them, Chris, leaned over to the chief data analyst, whispering, This isn't the same model we approved last night." Another analyst, a young woman named Kelly, looked at Blake, her expression betraying her anxiety. "Blake, this formula, it might blow up in our faces if we go live with it. You can't risk it." The digital timer ticked closer to 0, the seconds ticking away like a countdown to impending doom. The room was divided, the pressure mounting. With each passing second, Blake's gaze shifted from the screen to the door. Should they double-check? Should they risk the reputation of the company on a formula that might be flawed? The fear of looking weak, of losing control, gnawed at him. And yet something in him told him that this was the moment. He had to trust something deeper, something beyond the surface of the spreadsheets and the projections. As the discussion grew louder, the door to the boardroom swung open, and Thomas appeared in the doorway again, mop in hand. Blake barely noticed him at first, but then his eyes met Thomas's steady, unflinching gaze. "Sir," Thomas spoke quietly, his voice carrying through the tension in the room. "I can fix it." Everyone froze, their eyes turning toward him. But Thomas moved calmly to the whiteboard, his mop left behind at the door. He picked up a marker without asking, without waiting for permission. He knew what needed to be done, and the room was powerless to stop him. With a few swift movements, Thomas erased a few lines and replaced them with a new set of equations. The room watched in stunned silence as the mathematician, began. "To explain the math behind the correction, your churn model is based on outdated data. The post-pandemic behavior doesn't match your assumptions. You've used a fixed decay model when it should be dynamic. Here, this adjustment will show a more realistic forecast." he continued, explaining the finer points of the model, each correction delivered with quiet authority. Blake stood there, his arms crossed, his mind racing. He was still struggling to comprehend how a janitor, someone no one had paid attention to, could be solving their problems in a matter of minutes. Thomas finished adjusting the formula, and with a final circle of the marker, he stepped back. There, now it's ready for review. The room was silent. Everyone turned toward the screen, unsure what to expect. But as they ran the model, the projections updated in real time, stronger, more reliable, and aligned with recent data. Blake felt his stomach churn. This was it. Either they accepted the change or risked losing everything. He turned to the room, eyes wide, trying to reconcile the moment. "Go live," he said, his voice unexpectedly calm. The countdown hit 0. The boardroom was still buzzing, the hum of anxiety building as the seconds ticked away. Blake Thornwell stood motionless, staring at the screen. The digital timer read 0.2 seconds. He had made the decision to trust the janitor, Thomas Hill. But now his instincts were fighting him. There was a voice in his head, a familiar nagging doubt, reminding him of everything he had built. The empire, the reputation, the control. He wasn't used to being this vulnerable. "We're going live, Blake," Howard Denton, the CFO, said, his voice tight. "But this is risky." Blake turned to him, meeting his gaze with determination. "We've double-checked everything. Else trust me, Howard. This is the right call." But deep down, Blake's confidence was cracking. As the seconds ticked by, he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. What if Thomas's correction was wrong? What if the investors saw through it? Despite his doubt, he stepped forward and turned his attention back to the presentation. The room was tense. All eyes were on the projection screen as they awaited. The final confirmation of the corrected formula. "Do we proceed?" Blake asked, his voice steadier than he felt. The room was silent. No one wanted to answer, but they were all waiting for Blake's next move. Blake took a deep breath. With a final nod to himself, he gestured toward the screen. "We proceed. Let's make it count." The live pitch began, and Blake's voice filled the room. He smiled confidently, but his mind raced. The investors were waiting for him to deliver, to present the company's vision. But now, everything felt different. The weight of Thomas's correction, the knowledge that the formula could still be wrong, weighed heavily on his shoulders. As Blake continued his introduction, his mind replayed Thomas's calm instructions. The janitor had effortlessly pointed out the flaw in the churn rate assumption, the dynamic model that needed updating. At first, Blake had dismissed him as just a janitor, a man who didn't belong in a room full of executives. But as he stood there now, Blake realized how wrong he had been. When it came time to present the forecast numbers, Blake handed over the reins. Mira, the junior analyst, stood up and began to explain the updated projections, referencing Thomas's formula. "We've updated the churn model to reflect current post-pandemic behavior. The base loyalty tier is now adjusted to match new customer retention patterns. This corrected model is not only more accurate but also more defensible," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. For a moment, Blake glanced at the screen. The updated projections showed a much more conservative but realistic growth forecast. The numbers were now aligned with market data, and for the first time in hours, Blake felt a flicker of relief. As the pitch continued, Jade, who had not yet been revealed as the true savior of the day, was walking down the hall, her mind drifting. As a child, she had never dreamed of working in the corporate world. Her dreams had always been simpler, dreams of solving the world's problems through mathematics and data. She had been a math prodigy, a star in her field, and her mind had always been occupied with numbers, models, and projections. But life had other plans. When her mother's sudden stroke led to the collapse of her family's financial stability, Jade had to give up her dream of pursuing a PhD in data science. She had chosen to become a waitress, a janitor, working long hours just to make ends meet. In the process, she buried her passion, her talent, and the drive that once defined her. Today, though, everything had changed. With the formula's correction, she had broken free from her invisible role. It wasn't just a correction, it was a reclaiming of her power. She had done what was necessary, not for fame, but for the truth, for the clarity that had always been in her mind, the thought of her old life, the life that had been ripped away by circumstance, burned at her. But she pushed it back. She had found a way to use the knowledge she had left behind, knowledge that had been ignored for far too long. And for the first time in years, Jade felt her genius acknowledged, even if in the most unlikely of circumstances. The pitch concluded, and the investors' reactions were immediate. They began asking questions, probing into the details of the new formula. The room held its breath. Would they buy it? Could they be convinced? One investor, a woman from Fenton Marsh Capital, raised her hand. "You've updated the churn model to reflect customer behavior. Can you speak to how this might impact long-term growth projections? We're particularly concerned with sustainability." Mira, standing confidently beside the projection screen, answered swiftly. "We've accounted for shifts in consumer loyalty, especially in the post-pandemic market. These changes lead to more predictable, sustainable growth rates with less volatility. The revised forecast is backed by recent data, and we've used it to stress test the model." The investor nodded slowly, tapping her pen against her notepad. "Interesting," she murmured. "It holds." Blake watched as the investors leaned forward, their faces a mix of intrigue and approval. There was no immediate applause, but the tension that had once gripped the room was slowly dissipating. They weren't dismissing the numbers, and more importantly, they weren't dismissing the company's leadership. As the meeting continued, Blake's internal conflict began to clear. The room was coming to a consensus. Thomas's correction was not just acceptable, it had made the forecast stronger, more reliable. Blake looked around the table at the executives. The panic had eased. They were seeing something they hadn't expected. The possibility of growth based on real data, not inflated projections. When the meeting ended, Blake felt the weight of the deal lift off his shoulders. The investors agreed to move forward with the merger, and the room erupted in a mix of relief and celebration. But it wasn't until later, when the applause faded and the executives began to congratulate each other, that Blake truly understood what had just happened. He turned to Mira, his voice quiet but genuine. "You did well," he said. "And so did Thomas. I owe him an apology." Mira smiled, her eyes sparkling with a mix of pride and surprise. "We all do, Blake." As the applause died down and the investors began to filter out of the boardroom, Blake Thornwell stood still, his mind still processing what had just transpired. The weight of the decision he had made pressed heavily on his shoulders. The $150 million deal had been secured, and his company was poised for a bright future. But there was something else nagging at him, something more personal. He had trusted a janitor, a man who had, just hours earlier, been invisible to everyone in the room. And now, thanks to his quiet intervention, they had a stronger, more reliable forecast. Blake ran his hand through his hair, frustration creeping into his thoughts. What did it say about him, about his leadership, that he hadn't noticed the flaw in the formula? How could someone in a janitor's uniform have seen it when his own CFO, his own top analysts, had missed it? Blake's eyes flickered to the empty chair at the head of the table, where he had once stood, confident, controlling, in charge. The moment felt surreal. Why had it taken a janitor to make this change? Blake wondered. His world, one built on control, on intellect, on leadership, had just been shaken to its core. The stark contrast between his position and Thomas's made him feel small in a way he hadn't experienced before. The door to the boardroom opened again, and Blake turned, expecting to see a member of the tech team or another executive. But it was Thomas, standing in the doorway with the same calm expression he'd worn all day. No mop, no tray, just the man who had changed everything. His gaze met Blake's with the same unflinching steadiness. "I think we need to talk," Blake said, his voice quieter than usual. As Blake led Thomas into his office, the room felt too large, the silence too thick. Blake gestured toward the chair across from his desk, but Thomas didn't sit down. He simply stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting. Blake couldn't remember the last time someone had made him feel this unsettled, especially someone like Thomas, whose presence shouldn't have commanded any attention at all. Blake motioned toward the papers scattered across his desk. Charts, projections, all now rendered irrelevant by Thomas's correction. "We've done it," Blake said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "The investors are on board. The deal is locked in." Thomas nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You trusted me, Blake. That's all that matters." Blake's brow furrowed. "I trusted a janitor, I trusted you, and now we're on the brink of something huge." His voice dropped. "But that's not why I wanted to talk." Thomas raised an eyebrow, but he didn't interrupt. Blake stood, his fingers drumming on the edge of his desk. "I've built this company on the belief that I know everything, that I have all the answers. But today, you showed me that I was wrong." He turned and walked to the window, looking out over the skyline. "What does that make me?" The silence stretched, the weight of his words settling between them. "You're human," Thomas finally said, his voice calm. "And it takes a certain kind of humility to admit when you're wrong." Blake sighed, running a hand over his face. "I've spent years building this company, this image. It's everything to me. But today I realized that my control, my need to always have the answers, could have cost me everything." He turned back to face Thomas. "It was never about the deal. It was about realizing that I've been blind to what really matters, what's always been right in front of me." Back in the boardroom, the executives were still reeling from the events of the day. They had walked out of the meeting with a signed deal, but the air was thick with uncertainty. Blake had made the final call to go live with the corrected formula, but behind closed doors, the murmurs of discontent were growing. Randall Kane, an older board member known for his sharp tongue and relentless ambition, leaned in toward the others. "This is absurd. You're telling me we trusted a janitor's advice over the work of our entire financial team?" He sneered. "I don't care what the numbers say. This wasn't supposed to happen." Howard Denton, the CFO, shifted uncomfortably. He was right. The formula was wrong. We would have gone live with an inflated forecast, and investors would have seen it for what it was. Randall scoffed. "It's not about being right. It's about who's allowed to have a voice. A janitor, an outsider, should never have had the chance to even speak. This is a precedent we can't ignore." The conversation continued, tension escalating, as some executives voiced their support for Blake's decision to trust Thomas, while others felt the situation had undermined their professional authority. Blake, back in his office, had no idea how much internal discord was brewing, but soon he would have to face the consequences of the decision he had made, and it wouldn't be easy. In the days following the pitch, the company's internal culture began to shift. Blake realized that in trusting Thomas, he had opened a door to change, not just in the company, but within himself. He began questioning everything he had believed about leadership. Thomas's insight was more than just a correction to the formula. It was a reminder of the untapped potential that lay outside the world of power suits and board meetings. Blake found himself seeking out employees who, like Thomas, had been overlooked. He started to engage with the people who made the company run behind the scenes. People like Thomas, realizing that they held the kind of intelligence and creativity that often went unnoticed. As the company moved forward with the merger, Blake's approach to leadership slowly began to evolve. He wasn't just the face of the company anymore. He was learning to be a leader who embraced collaboration, who valued all voices, not just the ones that came from the top down. The next morning, the weight of the decision still hung over Blake Thornwell as he walked into the boardroom. The deal had been sealed. The $150 million merger was set to proceed, and investors had approved the revised projections. Yet there was an undercurrent of tension that Blake couldn't ignore. When the team reconvened to debrief, Randall Kane, the older and more established board member, was first to speak. His voice was laced with frustration. "Blake, we're all grateful. The deal went through, but you can't just let this pass. A janitor, a low-level employee. How did we let him in the door? Blake kept his gaze steady. He knew this conversation was coming. He had expected the resistance, especially from those who had built their careers on control, on making all the decisions. But this time, Blake wasn't interested in defending his position. Instead, he was focused on the bigger picture. I'm not saying we should disregard what we've built, but I am saying that Thomas's insight saved us. Blake responded calmly. The formula was wrong. I made a judgment call, and it paid off. Howard Denton, the CFO, who had initially been hesitant, but ultimately supported Blake's decision, added, "The fact remains that the formula was flawed. If we hadn't corrected it, we would have lost the deal. This isn't about Thomas's title, it's about the fact that he saw something we missed." But Randall, unrelenting, leaned forward. "What does this say about our authority? About how decisions should be made? It undermines the team." Blake exhaled slowly. He had expected a pushback, but it didn't make it any easier. "I'll tell you what it says," Blake said, his voice rising slightly. "It says that we need to stop assuming brilliance comes from the top down. Maybe we've been looking in the wrong places for answers." The room fell silent. Blake knew the internal resistance wasn't over, but he also knew this was the first step toward change. The battle wasn't won yet, but it had begun. Meanwhile, Thomas Hill, the janitor who had unknowingly become the catalyst for change, was navigating his own whirlwind of emotions. Since the pitch, he had been offered an unofficial consulting role within the company. Blake had reached out to him, asking for his input on some of the company's data analysis strategies, knowing that Thomas's mind was capable of things he hadn't yet tapped into. But Thomas had his doubts. He wasn't sure if he belonged in the corporate world again. He had spent too many years working in the background, wearing the mask of the invisible janitor. For so long, he had resigned himself to a life of quiet obscurity. It felt safer. Yet now, in the midst of this storm of change, he found himself wondering if he had been meant for more. One afternoon, as he was wiping down the hallway near the conference room, Blake approached him again. "Thomas, we need your help," he said, offering a tentative smile. "We're forming a new strategy team, an innovation incubator, and I want you to be part of it." Thomas looked at him, unsure of what to say. "I'm just a janitor," he muttered, almost to himself. Blake shook his head. "No, Thomas, you're a problem solver. We need people like you." For a long moment, Thomas didn't speak, but something inside him stirred, an old familiar spark of purpose that he thought he had buried for good. Maybe, just maybe, he could return to the work that once set his mind on fire. As Blake and Thomas navigated their evolving relationship, the corporate atmosphere began to shift. Blake had made a public commitment to trust unconventional voices within the company. He started listening to the overlooked employees, those who had always been invisible in the corporate hierarchy. A new project was born out of this shift, the Thornwell Solutions Innovation Incubator. Blake had envisioned it as a space where unconventional ideas and creative minds could come together to disrupt the status quo. It would be a place where knowledge, regardless of who it came from, was valued. Blake began to realize that by ignoring certain voices in the past, Thornwell Solutions had missed out on opportunities for true innovation. Thomas's role was pivotal in shaping this incubator. He helped create data models that not only improved the company's operations, but also guided its future growth. And while he remained somewhat distant from the limelight, he started to feel his presence and contributions recognized, no longer relegated to the background of the office halls. As the days passed and the company's internal culture began to transform, Blake found himself in uncharted territory. His thoughts frequently returned to the janitor who had changed the trajectory of his company. What had Thomas seen that others had missed? It wasn't just about the formula, it was about trust, about realizing that knowledge, creativity, and brilliance weren't confined to a select few in suits. They were everywhere. In one of their many late-night discussions, Blake said to Thomas, "I don't know if I would have made it through this without you." Thomas, always modest, gave a small smile. You would have, but it might have taken longer. Blake laughed softly. Maybe, but I'm glad it didn't. The transformation at Thornwell Solutions was just beginning, and for the first time in years, Blake didn't feel like the weight of the world was on his shoulders alone. He had learned to trust not only Thomas, but also the value of perspectives beyond his own. The success of the $150 million deal was no longer up for debate. The financial world had been watching, and Thornwell Solutions had come through with a stronger, more reliable forecast, one that, thanks to Thomas Hill, had been corrected at the last moment. The company's future was secure, and yet as Blake sat in his office, the relief was short-lived. Blake had expected a wave of congratulations, high fives from the team, and perhaps even a celebration. But instead, there was something else in the air: unease. While the deal had been signed and the investors were pleased with the new projections, the internal culture at Thornwell Solutions had begun to shift. Blake could feel the tension building in the boardroom and beyond. Some of the senior executives still could not shake the feeling that Blake had undermined their authority by trusting Thomas, a janitor, over the company's own top analysts. The more outspoken ones, like Randall Kane, continued to question the legitimacy of the decision. A janitor doesn't belong in a room full of top-tier professionals, Randall had said, and his voice echoed in Blake's mind. Despite their success, Blake could sense that the trust within his leadership team was fracturing. No one had expected the chain of events that led to the successful correction of the formula, and there was no denying the discomfort that some felt about the entire situation. How could they continue forward with Thomas now playing a central role in the company? Blake had tried to stay calm, but his thoughts kept returning to the same question: what had he learned from all of this? For Thomas, life was different now. No longer just the janitor, he found himself thrust into the spotlight, albeit reluctantly. Blake had invited him to several key meetings and discussions, bringing him in as an unofficial advisor. But Thomas was no stranger to feeling out of place. He had spent years in the background, keeping his thoughts and brilliance hidden behind the closed doors of university lecture halls, and then later, behind the mop and bucket. He had always known he was capable of more, but the life he had chosen was about survival, not recognition. Now, with Thornwell Solutions asking for his expertise, he was unsure of how to proceed. He didn't want the limelight, nor did he care for the title. But the company needed him, and that was a reality he couldn't ignore. The decision Blake made to bring Thomas on board had certainly paid off, but not without consequences. The other executives viewed Thomas's role as an intrusion, and they didn't understand why Blake was so eager to elevate him. It was becoming clear that the company's shift toward inclusivity, toward valuing voices that had traditionally been ignored, wasn't going to come easily. Thomas spent long nights in his office at the back of the building, reviewing data models, providing feedback, and offering suggestions. Each time he left a meeting, he felt the weight of his new role. Was he really cut out for this? Was he just a fluke, a stroke of luck that had corrected the formula at the last minute? But despite the questions that gnawed at him, Thomas felt a spark. Maybe, just maybe, this was where he was supposed to be, offering his talents to a place that needed them, even if it wasn't in the way he had originally envisioned. Blake's resolve grew as he navigated the internal storm that brewed after the deal. He wasn't going to let the executives' doubts derail the progress they had made. He knew change would take time, but he also knew that the company's future depended on transforming its culture, not just the numbers. In the days following the deal, Blake initiated a series of meetings with his leadership team. He knew he had to address the growing division and rebuild trust among the executives, but it wasn't going to be easy. There were those who resisted change, who saw Thomas's involvement as a threat, and who didn't believe in the idea of trusting unconventional voices. Change is never easy, Blake began during one of the board meetings, his voice steady. But we've seen firsthand what happens when we open the doors to people who don't fit the mold. I'm not asking anyone to surrender their authority, but I am asking you to consider that brilliance doesn't always come with a title or a suit." He paused, making sure his words landed. The room was silent. We need to break down these barriers. We need to stop assuming that innovation only comes from those who've been in the boardroom for years. Thomas showed us that. And I'm telling you now, we are going to change this company, starting with the way we view talent. The room was still tense, but Blake's words struck a chord with some. Howard Denton, the CFO, who had initially been skeptical of Thomas's role, nodded thoughtfully. "We'll need to make this shift gradually, but I agree. There's room for more voices." Blake exhaled, a weight lifting from his shoulders. This wasn't going to be an overnight transformation, but the first step had been taken. The culture was beginning to shift, slowly but surely. In the midst of this growing internal change, Blake found himself facing a different challenge. As the days went on, he realized that his own leadership had to change too. He couldn't continue running the company the way he always had. The decisions he had made, the walls he had built, were no longer sustainable. He needed to trust his team more, to allow others to take ownership. For the first time in a long while, Blake allowed himself to step back and look at the bigger picture. The company's success no longer hinged on his every move. He was no longer the sole architect of their future. Blake made the decision to formally incorporate Thomas's perspective into the company's new innovation incubator. He saw Thomas as a vital part of their future. And in doing so, he not only recognized Thomas's potential, but also signaled to the rest of the company that change was here. In a final, quiet moment in his office, Blake made a call to Thomas. "We're launching the incubator, and I want you to be at the center of it. We need people like you, people who see the world differently." After Blake's announcement of the new innovation incubator, everything began to shift. The incubator was designed to be a space where unconventional ideas were given room to grow, where creativity wasn't just encouraged, but expected. Blake made it clear that this wasn't just about new products or services, it was about fostering a culture of innovation from the ground up. The company's success, he believed, would now depend not on maintaining the status quo, but on embracing diverse perspectives and new approaches. For Thomas Hill, this was both a moment of excitement and discomfort. He had never seen himself as someone who belonged in a boardroom or at the center of a corporate initiative. But here he was, tasked with shaping the future of Thornwell Solutions. The new position allowed him to use his mathematical brilliance and experience to advise on the company's most important decisions. But it also thrust him into a world he had long avoided. In the early days, Thomas spent hours in his new office, poring over data sets and helping the new team brainstorm ideas. His experience, knowledge, and quiet genius were invaluable, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. The shiny new office, the polished floors, the sharp suits. It felt strange after years of being in the background. But every time he offered a solution or contributed a fresh perspective, something inside him stirred. He knew that he was making a difference, not just in the company, but in the way it operated. He was still adjusting to the changes, but one thing was clear. His role was no longer confined to the shadows. For Blake Thornwell, the launch of the innovation incubator was a turning point. But with the company's success came internal challenges he hadn't anticipated. The executives who had once followed his lead unquestioningly were now hesitant, unsure of the future, and unsure of him. Their loyalty had been shaken, and Blake knew he had to prove himself once again. Blake spent late nights in his office, thinking about what had brought him to this moment. He'd spent so many years climbing the corporate ladder, building the company brick by brick, relying on his ability to control every aspect of the business. But now everything was different. He was forced to let go of the need for control. It wasn't easy for Blake, but he knew that the company had to evolve if it was going to thrive. One evening, Blake sat down with Howard Denton, the CFO, who had become one of his few trusted allies through the change. "I can't shake the feeling that I've lost something," Blake admitted, running a hand over his face. I've spent so many years building this company, but now I'm not sure I know how to lead it anymore. Howard sat back in his chair, considering the words carefully. You've changed, Blake. This company has changed, and that's not a bad thing. People are looking to you for guidance, but they also need to see you adapt. They need to see that you trust them. Blake nodded slowly. Trust. That's the hardest part for me. I've spent my entire career trusting no one but myself. Howard smiled slightly. Well, now you have to trust a janitor, don't you? Blake chuckled softly, the weight of the conversation momentarily lifting. I suppose I do. Not everyone in the company was as enthusiastic about the changes. Randall Kane, one of the senior board members, continued to challenge Blake's vision. As much as Blake had tried to integrate unconventional voices into the company's leadership, Randall and a few others refused to accept the shift. In an all-hands meeting, Randall made his discontent clear. This is madness, Blake. You're talking about embracing talent from all corners, people who haven't earned their place. What happened to the company we've built? The one where the experts lead, where experience matters. Blake stood, firm in his response. Randall, experience matters, but so does adaptability. The world is changing, and if we want to keep up, we need to be willing to evolve. We need people who can see things from a different perspective. But Randall wasn't convinced. I'm not saying we abandon the foundation, but this is too much, Blake. You're letting people like Thomas, a janitor, set the tone. Where does it end? Blake didn't have a perfect answer, but he knew one thing. It was a necessary shift. The company needed to embrace this new culture of innovation, even if it meant facing resistance from those who clung to the old ways. Weeks after the incubator's official launch, the first big idea emerged. It wasn't a flashy, immediate success, but it was something new, something that felt different from the traditional models the company had relied on for so long. A team of analysts, led by Thomas, had developed a new predictive analytics model based on customer behavior, something that hadn't been fully explored in the past. The new approach had the potential to not only revolutionize the company's marketing strategy, but also provide valuable insights for their product development teams. Blake watched the team present their findings to the board. They spoke with the kind of passion and conviction that had been missing from Thornwell Solutions for years. For the first time, Blake realized the power of trusting his team, not just in the results, but in the process. When the presentation ended, there was a palpable shift in the room. Blake could see it in the faces of the board members. The energy was different. It wasn't just about profits anymore. It was about people, ideas, and creating something new. Blake couldn't help but feel a small wave of pride wash over him. This was what he had wanted all along, a company that didn't just survive, but thrived in new, unexpected ways. As the weeks passed, the transformation at Thornwell Solutions began to take shape more visibly. The innovation incubator, once a mere idea, was now a thriving hub of creativity where employees from all levels of the company were encouraged to bring new, disruptive ideas to the table. Blake Thornwell had changed. The walls he had once built around himself were beginning to crumble, and in their place stood a more open, inclusive, and forward-thinking leader. Thomas Hill, the man, who had once been confined to the background, had become an integral part of this new vision. He worked closely with the data scientists, engineers, and analysts, helping them refine their models and guiding them to see things from angles they had never considered before. Thomas had found his place, not just as a consultant, but as a key figure in shaping the company's future. Blake had made the decision to allow others to take ownership, and that decision was paying off. The company was no longer reliant on a small group of top executives making all the decisions. The energy in the office had shifted. There was a palpable sense of purpose among employees. They weren't just working to meet quotas anymore. They were working to innovate, to challenge the norms, and to build something that could stand the test of time. As the company grew, so did its reputation. Investors and clients began to notice the difference, and the stock price surged. Thornwell Solutions wasn't just a successful corporation, it was a symbol of how a company could evolve by embracing its people, no matter where they came from or what their title was. One evening, as Blake sat in his office overlooking the city skyline, he reflected on the journey he had taken. His once ironclad belief in control had given way to trust. Trust in his team, trust in innovation, and most surprisingly, trust in the people he had once overlooked. He thought back to the pivotal moment when Thomas had corrected the formula, the moment that had altered the trajectory of his company. At the time, Blake had been unsure whether trusting Thomas was the right decision. But now, looking at the success the company had achieved, he knew that it was the best decision he had ever made. Blake leaned back in his chair, taking in the view of the city. It was an expansive sight, just like the future of Thornwell Solutions. He had once seen the company's future as a clear, linear path, but now it was a web of possibilities, an ever-evolving landscape filled with the promise of new ideas, voices, and opportunities. And at the heart of it all was the recognition that brilliance wasn't confined to a select few. It was everywhere. Thomas, on the other hand, had found peace with his new role. He still wasn't entirely comfortable with the spotlight, but he had come to realize that he didn't need to be. He wasn't in this for recognition or accolades. He was in it because he knew he could make a difference. One afternoon, as Thomas sat with a group of young analysts, helping them refine their latest predictive model, he noticed something that filled him with pride. They were no longer just asking for his guidance. They were asking each other, collaborating, innovating. The team had become a reflection of the company's new spirit, one of openness, curiosity, and a willingness to learn from everyone, regardless of their title or background. Thomas had never imagined that his quiet brilliance would lead to this moment. He had once thought that his contributions were only valuable in the classroom or in academic journals. But now he saw that his real legacy was not in the equations he had written years ago, but in the lives he had touched and the ideas he had inspired. He walked through the halls of Thornwell Solutions, feeling the hum of excitement in the air. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged. This wasn't just a job anymore, it was a purpose. 2 months later, Thornwell Solutions hosted its first ever Equity in Innovation Forum, celebrating women in STEM and underrepresented voices. In business, Blake, who had once been a leader who guarded his position with unwavering authority, now found himself at the forefront of a company that embraced diversity and inclusivity. The stage was set for others to follow in the footsteps of Thomas, to recognize that talent could come from anyone, anywhere. Blake stood at the podium during the event, looking out at the packed room filled with entrepreneurs, investors, and employees. The crowd was buzzing with excitement, but there was also a sense of gratitude in the air, a recognition of how far Thornwell Solutions had come. When we talk about innovation, Blake began, his voice clear and steady, we often think about new products, new technologies, new services. But true innovation comes from people, people who dare to think differently, people who are often overlooked, people who see the world in a way no one else does. He paused, his eyes searching the crowd until they landed on Thomas, who sat quietly. In the front row, Blake smiled, the weight of the past few months finally sinking in. Sometimes innovation doesn't come from a fancy title or a boardroom. Sometimes it comes from the person who's been there all along, waiting for the chance to be heard. The crowd erupted in applause. Blake turned to Thomas and nodded. You showed us that, Thomas. Thank you.